The year was 2387, and space around Earth looked like a graveyard. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Liberty, watching through the main screen as pieces of destroyed human ships floated past like metal snow. Some of those pieces had been his friends just hours ago. The Henderson, the Valiant, the New Hope, all gone now, torn apart by weapons that humans barely understood. The Liberty was alone now, the last warship of Earth's defense fleet still fighting. Around them, the Zephyrian armada moved like hungry sharks. Their ships looked nothing like human vessels. They were alive somehow, with hulls that pulsed like giant hearts and weapons that grew from their sides like deadly flowers. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Morrison had stopped counting after the first 50. Lieutenant Amy Carter turned from her station, her face pale but steady. "Captain, main engines are offline. We lost power coupling on deck 15. Life support is failing on decks 12 through 18. She paused, checking her screen again. "We've lost 60% of our crew, sir." Morrison nodded slowly. He had expected this news, but hearing it still felt like a punch to the stomach. 60%. That meant almost 2,000 people were dead or dying. Good people. People with families back on Earth. People with dreams and hopes and futures that would never happen now. Commander Lisa Brooks, his second in command for the past 8 years, looked up from her communications panel. "Sir, we're getting a transmission from the Zephyrian flagship. They want to talk." Morrison straightened his uniform jacket, though it was torn and stained with smoke. "Put them through." The main screen flickered, and suddenly they were looking at something that might have been a face. The Zephyrian High Admiral was tall and thin, with skin that looked like polished metal. His eyes were too large and completely black, like pools of oil. When he spoke, his voice came through the speakers in perfect English, though his mouth barely moved. "Human captain," the alien said, and somehow managed to make the words sound like an insult. "Your fleet is destroyed. Your planet burns. Your colonies fall one by one like dominoes. This is your final moment of choice." Morrison felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm listening. Surrender now, and your remaining crew will be processed as labor units. They will live, though they will serve the Zephyrian Empire for the rest of their natural lives. Refuse, and we will tear your ship apart piece by piece until nothing remains but space dust." The alien leaned forward, and Morrison could see his reflection in those black eyes. "Your resistance has been amusing, but futile. Your technology is primitive. Your tactics are predictable. Your will to fight is nearly broken. We have conquered 1,000 worlds, Captain Morrison. 1,000 species that thought themselves strong. All of them knelt before us in the end." Morrison looked around his bridge. Engineer Pete Davis stood near the power controls, his uniform dirty from crawling through damaged conduits. Communications officer Kate Turner kept working at her station, her hands steady, even though tears ran down her cheeks. Weapons specialist. Ryan Bell stared at the alien on the screen with pure hatred in his eyes. These were his people. They had followed him through 3 years of war, through battles that seemed impossible to win. They had watched their friends die, their ships burn, their homes get destroyed, and still they stood at their posts. "You want an answer?" Morrison said finally. "Here it is. Humans don't surrender. Not when we're defending our home. Not when we're protecting the people we love. And especially not to something like you." The Zephyrian Admiral's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those black eyes. Amusement, maybe, or surprise. "How wonderfully primitive." "Very well, Captain Morrison. You have one of your Earth hours to reconsider. After that, we will demonstrate why resistance is futile." The screen went black. For a moment, the bridge was completely silent, except for the hum of failing systems and the distant sound of emergency alarms. Pete Davis was the first to speak. "Captain, with respect, we can't fight hundreds of ships with one damaged vessel. Our main guns are down to 30% power. We have maybe 20 missiles left. And if we lose life support in the damaged sections..." "I know, Pete." Morrison walked to the captain's chair and sat down heavily. "I know the odds. Believe me, I know. Lisa Brooks moved to stand beside him. "So what do we do, Jake?" Morrison looked at each of his officers in turn. These people had trusted him to lead them through hell, and he had done his best. But his best hadn't been enough to save Earth. It hadn't been enough to save the fleet. It hadn't been enough to save the thousands of people who were counting on them. But maybe it could be enough for one last thing. He reached for the ship's intercom and pressed the activation button. Throughout the Liberty, his voice would reach every surviving crew member, from the engine rooms to the medical bays to the weapons lockers. "This is the captain speaking," he said, his voice echoing through corridors filled with smoke and emergency lighting. "I won't lie to you about our situation. We're the last ship of the fleet. We're outnumbered by odds I can't even calculate. Our engines are damaged, our weapons are nearly depleted, and we're cut off from any hope of reinforcement." He paused, letting that sink in. When he continued, his voice was stronger. "The aliens have given us a choice: surrender and become slaves or die fighting. They think that's an easy choice. They think we'll choose life over freedom, survival over honor. They've conquered 1,000 worlds, and apparently, that's the choice every other species has made." Morrison stood up from his chair, and somehow his voice carried throughout the ship with absolute clarity. "But they don't understand something about humans. We don't fight because we think we can win. We fight because it's right. We fight because some things are worth dying for, and we fight hardest when we have nothing left to lose." The intercom crackled with responses from throughout the ship. Voices calling out agreement, voices promising to stand with him, voices that should have been broken by despair but instead rang with determination. "So here's what we're going to do," Morrison continued. "We're going to show these aliens something they've never seen before. We're going to show them what happens when humans decide that surrender is not an option. We're going to make them remember this day for as long as their empire exists." He released the intercom button and looked around. The bridge. Amy Carter was checking her instruments with renewed focus. Pete Davis was already heading toward the engine room, his step quick and purposeful. Kate Turner was adjusting communication frequencies, preparing for whatever came next. Ryan Bell was running diagnostics on their remaining weapons. Lisa Brooks smiled at him, and for a moment she looked like the young lieutenant he had first met 12 years ago. "So, Captain, what's the plan?" Morrison looked at the tactical display showing the Zephyrian fleet surrounding them like a closing fist. One human ship against hundreds of alien vessels. It should have been the end of the story. Instead, it felt like the beginning. 45 minutes remained before the Zephyrian ultimatum would expire, and the USS Liberty buzzed with desperate activity. In the depths of the ship, Chief Engineer Pete Davis wiped sweat from his forehead as he stared at the massive power core that had kept their ship alive for 3 years of war. Now it was dying, just like everything else. "Captain, you need to see this," Pete said into his communicator, his voice tight with exhaustion. Minutes later, Morrison arrived in the engine room with Lisa Brooks at his side. The space around them hummed with failing systems. Pipes leaked. Coolant and steady drips and emergency lights cast everything in an eerie red glow. Pete led them to the main power display, where numbers and graphs told a story of slow mechanical death. "The power core took a direct hit during the last attack," Pete explained, pointing to a section of twisted metal and exposed wiring. "It's not going to last another hour even if we don't use any weapons. But I've been thinking about something crazy." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "How crazy?" "The kind of crazy that might get us all killed faster, but might also give us one last chance to hurt them." Pete pulled up a schematic on his tablet. "We can reroute power from the life support systems throughout the damaged sections of the ship. All of it. Every single joule." Lisa Brooks stepped closer to look at the numbers. "Pete, that would mean... It would mean sacrificing the people trapped in those sections," Pete finished quietly. "The ones who are too hurt to move, the ones we can't evacuate. We'd be killing our own people to power our weapons for maybe 90 seconds. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of their dying ship. Finally, Morrison spoke. "How much power are we talking about?" "Enough to overload every weapon system we have left. Enough to make our missiles, hit like nuclear bombs instead of conventional explosives, enough to turn our particle beams into ship killers. Pete's voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly. It would be the biggest weapons discharge in human history. Dr. Helen Grant's voice came over the intercom, requesting Morrison's presence in the medical bay. When they arrived, they found her tending to dozens of wounded crew members. Some lay on stretchers in the corridors because there weren't enough beds. Others sat against walls holding bandages to wounds that would have sent them home in peacetime. "Captain," Dr. Grant said, pulling him aside, "I heard what Pete is proposing. I've been through the damaged sections. We have 43 people trapped behind collapsed bulkheads on Deck 12. 18 more in the destroyed section of Deck 15. Most of them won't survive the next 2 hours even if we do nothing." She looked directly into Morrison's eyes. "I'm not saying it's an easy choice, but if we're going to ask people to die for this ship, we should ask the ones who are dying anyway." Meanwhile, Lieutenant Amy Carter had been working at her station for hours, pulling apart damaged communication equipment and rebuilding it into something new. Kate Turner found her surrounded by spare parts, wire fragments, and half-assembled devices that looked like they belonged in a mad scientist's laboratory. "Amy, what are you building?" Kate asked. "I've been analyzing the Zephyrian communication signals," Amy replied, not looking up from her work. "Their ships don't just talk to each other, they think together. It's like their entire fleet shares one big brain." She held up a device that looked like a radio had been crossed with a broken computer. "If I can broadcast on the right frequency with enough power, I might be able to confuse that shared brain. Make their ships think they're getting contradictory orders." Kate stared at the device. "Would that work?" "I don't know, but I've been listening to their chatter, and I noticed something else. They're planning to broadcast our surrender live to every human colony they've conquered. They want to use us as proof that resistance is hopeless." Amy finally looked up, her eyes bright with determination. "But what if we broadcast something different instead?" In the weapons bay, Ryan Bell was performing what he called aggressive maintenance on their remaining missiles. This involved removing every safety system, overriding every power limitation, and essentially turning each missile into a barely controlled explosion waiting to happen. "These things are going to be unstable as hell," he told Morrison when the captain came to check on his progress. "But they'll hit 3 times harder than they're supposed to." Morrison watched as Ryan worked with tools and parts that were never meant to go together. "How many do we have?" 22 missiles that might work, and 8 that definitely won't work, but might explode in an interesting way. Ryan grinned, and Morrison realized the weapons specialist was actually enjoying himself. "I figure if we're going out, we might as well go out with the biggest bang possible." Throughout the ship, crew members were making similar preparations. Chef Tony Miller had abandoned his kitchen to help load ammunition, his strong arms carrying shells that normally required 2 people to lift. Maintenance worker Carol Stone was rewiring backup systems by hand, crawling through access tunnels that were barely wide enough for a person to fit. In the medical bay, injured crew members were volunteering for jobs they could barely perform. Ensign Bobby Wright, with his left arm in a sling, was helping Dr. Grant distribute emergency oxygen masks. Lieutenant Sandra Cole, despite having a concussion, was organizing medical supplies that might be needed during the battle. Morrison made his way back to the bridge where he found his senior officers waiting for him. The countdown timer showed 38 minutes remaining. 38 minutes until the Zephyrians would expect their answer. "Status report," he said, settling into his captain's chair. Pete Davis spoke first. "The power rerouting is ready. When you give the word, I can channel everything we have into the weapons systems. It'll give us 90 seconds of maximum power, then the ship goes dark forever." Amy Carter nodded toward her rebuilt communications array. "The signal disruptor is ready. I can't guarantee it'll work, but it should cause some confusion in there. Fleet coordination." Ryan Bell cracked his knuckles. "Weapons are loaded and ready to party. These missiles are going to hit like the hammer of God." Kate Turner looked up from her station. "I've prepared a broadcast message for all human frequencies. If we're going down, everyone's going to know we didn't surrender." Lisa Brooks checked the tactical display one more time. The Zephyrian flagship is holding position about 2 kilometers from the main fleet. If we could get close enough. Morrison studied the display, watching the alien ships maintain their formation like predators, circling wounded prey. A plan was forming in his mind, desperate and probably suicidal, but it was a plan. "Here's what we're going to do," he said. "We're going to lie to them." He activated the ship's intercom one more time. "All hands, this is the captain. In 35 minutes, we're going to contact the Zephyrian admiral and tell him we surrender. We're going to ask permission to approach his flagship for the formal transfer of command. And when we get close enough, we're going to show him what human surrender really looks like." The intercom crackled with voices responding from throughout the ship. Voices that should have been broken by despair but instead rang with grim determination. Morrison smiled as he listened to his crew preparing for their final battle. The Zephyrians thought they understood humans. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The USS Liberty limped through space toward the massive Zephyrian flagship, leaving a trail of vented atmosphere and sparking debris behind her. From the outside, she looked like a dying animal crawling toward its predator. Her hull was scarred, with deep cuts from alien weapons. Whole sections were missing, and emergency lights flickered through broken windows like dying stars. Captain Jake Morrison stood at his position on the bridge, watching the distance numbers count down on his screen. 2,000 meters, 1,500, 1,000. The Zephyrian flagship grew larger with each passing second, its biomechanical hull pulsing with an eerie green light that made Morrison's skin crawl. Around them, the alien fleet held their positions like a pack of wolves watching their leader claim the kill. Hundreds of ships, each one capable of destroying the Liberty with ease. But they waited. They wanted to see this moment, this final surrender of the last human warship. In the engine room, Pete Davis made final adjustments to the power surge system he had built from desperation and spare parts. His hands moved quickly over controls that were never meant to work together. The power core hummed with unstable energy, barely held in check by systems that were failing one by one. "Engineering to bridge," Pete's voice came through the communicator, steady despite everything. "Deadman switch is ready, Captain. When you give the word, we'll have 90 seconds of maximum power before everything goes dark. After that, we're floating metal." Dr. Helen Grant moved through the ship's corridors, checking on crew members one last time. She carried emergency oxygen masks and medical supplies, but mostly she carried words of comfort. In the damaged sections, 43 people waited behind collapsed bulkheads, knowing they would never see home again. She had spoken to each of them, and not one had asked her to find another way. At her communications station, Amy Carter put the finishing touches on her signal disruptor. The device looked like it had been built by someone who was half genius and half crazy, which was probably accurate. She had no idea if it would actually work, but the frequency analysis looked promising. If the Zephyrian ships really did share a collective consciousness, this might confuse them long enough to matter. Kate Turner prepared her broadcast equipment, checking and double-checking every connection. The message she was about to send would reach every human settlement in known space. If they were going to die today, she would make sure everyone knew they died fighting. Ryan Bell stood in the weapons bay, surrounded by missiles that had been modified far beyond their original specifications. Each one was now essentially a small nuclear device, stripped of safety systems and packed with enough explosive power to crack a moon. They were beautiful and terrifying, and he was proud of every single one. The Liberty continued her slow approach toward the Zephyrian flagship. 800 meters now. The alien ship was enormous, easily 10 times the size of any human vessel. Its surface writhed with organic-looking weapons that tracked the Liberty's movement like eyes following prey. Morrison opened a communication channel to the Zephyrian admiral. The alien's metallic face appeared on the main screen, those black, oil-slick eyes reflecting the bridge lights. "Human captain," the alien said, and Morrison could hear satisfaction in that inhuman voice. "You have made the wise choice. Prepare to transfer command of your vessel to Zephyrian control." Morrison stood straighter, putting on his best defeated expression. "Admiral, I request permission to approach your flagship for the formal ceremony. It's It's important to us that this be done properly. A matter of human honor." The Zephyrian tilted his head, apparently amused by this display of primitive ritual. "How quaint." "Very well, Captain Morrison. Approach to within 100 meters. Any attempt at deception will result in the immediate destruction of your vessel." "Understood, Admiral. We're coming in now." Morrison cut the communication and looked around his bridge. His officers stood at their stations ready for what came next. Lisa Brooks gave him a small nod. Amy Carter's hand hovered over her signal disruptor. Kate Turner prepared to broadcast on all frequencies. In the engine room, Pete Davis waited for the signal that would flood their weapons with enough power to light up the void. The distance closed. 500 meters. 300. 200. The Zephyrian flagship filled their entire view now, a living mountain of metal and flesh that pulsed with alien power. Morrison could see weapon ports opening along its hull, ready to destroy them at the first sign of treachery. 150 meters. 120. The Liberty shuddered as tractor beams locked onto her hull, holding her in position. Morrison opened the communication channel again. The Zephyrian admiral's face appeared, looking pleased with himself. Behind him, Morrison could see other aliens preparing for what they thought would be a simple surrender ceremony. "Admiral," Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly across space, "before we formally surrender, I want you to understand something about humans." The alien leaned forward slightly, those black eyes reflecting Morrison's image. "Speak quickly." "Human." Morrison smiled, and for the first time in hours it was a genuine smile. "We don't surrender." He gave the signal. Everything happened at once. Pete Davis triggered the power surge, flooding every weapon system with energy that made the Liberty's hull glow like a small star. Ryan Bell fired every modified missile they had, sending 22 nuclear-powered projectiles screaming toward the Zephyrian flagship at point-blank range. Amy Carter activated her signal disruptor, broadcasting chaos across the alien fleet's shared consciousness. Kate Turner began transmitting their message to every human world in the galaxy. The Liberty's weapons lit up space with the brightness of a sun-going nova. Her particle beams, supercharged with 3 times normal power, carved through the Zephyrian flagship's hull like knives through paper. Her missiles struck almost simultaneously, each one exploding with the force of a small atomic bomb. The alien flagship staggered under the assault, its biomechanical hull rupturing in a dozen places. Atmosphere vented from massive holes, and strange alien fluids leaked into space like blood from giant wounds. The ship's organic weapons writhed and died, cut apart by sustained particle beam fire. But the real surprise came from Amy's signal disruptor. Throughout the Zephyrian fleet, ships began firing erratically as their shared consciousness dissolved into chaos. Some fired on empty space, others targeted their own vessels, and a few simply stopped moving entirely as their organic systems shut down in confusion. Morrison watched it all from the bridge of his dying ship. The Liberty was being torn apart by return fire, her hull cracking open like an egg. But she had done her job. The alien flagship was crippled, the fleet was in chaos, and Kate's message was broadcasting across the galaxy on every human frequency. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the USS Liberty." His voice echoed through space, reaching human colonies and resistance cells across known space. "We did not surrender. We will never surrender. Humanity does not kneel." The bridge exploded around him, but Morrison kept talking until the very end. "Remember us. Remember that humans fight. Remember that some things are worth dying for." The USS Liberty broke apart in a final explosion that lit up the void like a dying star. But her message traveled at the speed of light, carrying the news of humanity's defiance to every corner of the galaxy. The last human warship was gone, but her legacy was just beginning. 3 months after the Battle of the Liberty, the message that was supposed to show human defeat was doing something completely different. In hidden bases across the galaxy, resistance fighters gathered around crackling radio sets to listen to Captain Jake Morrison's final words over and over again. On the mining colony of New Dakota, Frank Cooper stood before 200 miners who had been ready to surrender just weeks ago. The Zephyrians had cut off their supply lines, destroyed their defensive satellites, and demanded they submit or starve. Most of the miners had families, children who needed food and medicine that only surrender might provide. But then Morrison's transmission had reached them. "Listen to this again," Frank said, playing the recording on his portable speaker. Morrison's voice filled the underground meeting hall, still clear despite the static from deep space. "We did not surrender. We will never surrender. Humanity does not kneel." The miners listened in silence. These were not soldiers. They were ordinary people who had come to New Dakota to dig for rare metals and build better lives for their families. But something in Morrison's voice changed them. When the recording ended, old Pete Miller stood up from the back row. "My grandson was on the Henderson," he said quietly. "Died 3 months ago when the fleet fell. But that Liberty captain, he's right. We don't kneel." The vote was unanimous. Instead of surrendering, the miners began planning coordinated strikes against Zephyrian supply convoys. They turned their industrial equipment into weapons and their mining tunnels into fortress networks. Within a week, they had destroyed 3 alien transport ships and freed 2 prison colonies. Similar scenes played out on dozens of worlds. The story of the Liberty's last stand spread through underground networks like wildfire, transforming defeat into inspiration. Human resistance cells that had been ready to give up suddenly found new reasons to fight. On Europa Station, former Navy engineer Sam Parker received the transmission while hiding in the ice mining tunnels beneath the moon's surface. He had been leading a small group of survivors, mostly civilians who had escaped when the Zephyrians conquered the Jupiter system. They had been planning to steal a transport ship and flee to the outer rim, as far from the war as possible. But Morrison's message changed everything. Sam gathered his people in the main tunnel, 37 survivors ranging from teenage mechanics to elderly scientists. The recording played in the cold air, Morrison's words echoing off ice walls that had never heard such defiance. The Liberty's engineer did something incredible. Sam told them, after the message ended. He found a way to overload their power systems, turn their whole ship into a weapon. "I've been studying the technical data hidden in the transmission signals." He pulled out his tablet, showing them schematics and power flow diagrams that he had been working on for weeks. "We can do the same thing. Take civilian ships, modify their fusion cores, turn them into one-time weapons that hit harder than military vessels." Dr. Sarah Walsh, a physicist who had been working on Jupiter's research stations, stepped forward to look at the plans. "Sam, this is suicide. Anyone who pilots these ships won't survive." "I know," Sam replied. "But look around. We're all going to die anyway if we keep running. The Zephyrians don't let humans live free. They either kill us or make us slaves. At least this way we die fighting." The first volunteer was Tommy Chen, a 19-year-old maintenance worker whose parents had died in the initial invasion. The second was Maria Santos, a cargo pilot whose sister had been captured by the aliens. By the end of the meeting, they had 12 volunteers ready to die for one chance to hurt the enemy. 6 months later, those converted ships struck their first target. 3 modified freighters, using Liberty-inspired power surge techniques, attacked a Zephyrian patrol fleet near the Titan shipyards. The enemy ships, expecting easy prey, found themselves facing weapons that burned with the concentrated fury of dying stars. All 3 human ships were destroyed, but they took down 8 Zephyrian vessels and damaged a dozen more before the end. More importantly, they reopened supply lines to 5 besieged human colonies, allowing thousands of people to receive food and medicine for the first time in months. The Zephyrian High Command began receiving reports that worried them. Human forces were no longer surrendering when cornered. Instead, they fought with increasing desperation and creativity. Ships that should have been easy captures were exploding like bombs. Civilians were turning mining equipment into weapons. Even unarmed colonists were finding ways to damage alien supply lines. Intelligence officer Nora Adams, working undercover in a Zephyrian data center on Proxima Station, discovered something that made her heart race with hope. The signal disruptor that Amy Carter had built on the Liberty was still having effects. The biomechanical ships in the alien fleet needed regular recalibration to maintain their shared consciousness, creating brief windows when they were vulnerable to attack. Nora sent this information through hidden channels to resistance cells across human space. Soon, coordinated attacks began hitting Zephyrian fleets during their recalibration periods. What had started as one ship's desperate last stand was becoming a galaxy-wide strategy. The first major Zephyrian retreat happened 8 months after the Liberty's destruction. A convoy of alien supply ships was returning from a conquered world when they encountered what appeared to be a small group of human refugees in damaged civilian vessels. The aliens moved in for easy captures, expecting no resistance from desperate colonists. Instead, they found themselves facing the new Liberty Squadron, 12 converted civilian ships crewed by volunteers who had memorized Morrison's final message. The battle lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, the entire Zephyrian convoy was destroyed, and supplies meant for 3 occupied worlds were floating free in space for human salvage teams to recover. Not one of the new Liberty ships survived, but their sacrifice allowed resistance forces to liberate an entire star system. The war was far from over, but something fundamental had changed. Zephyrian forces began reporting that humans seemed to view impossible odds as motivation rather than discouragement. The aliens, who had conquered 1,000 worlds through psychological warfare and overwhelming force, found themselves facing an enemy that simply refused to break. In the ruins of Earth's orbital defense platform, now a hidden base for the Resistance, a memorial wall grew larger each day. The names of every Liberty crew member were carved at the top, with Captain Jake Morrison's name in the center. Below them, new names appeared constantly as more volunteers joined what people were calling the Liberty Movement. The inscription below all the names was simple: "They refused to surrender, so we refused to give up." Children who had never seen Earth came to read those names and listen to Morrison's final transmission. They learned that humans had once built a ship called the Liberty, crewed her with people who chose death over slavery, and sent her out to show the galaxy what human defiance looked like. New ships launched from hidden shipyards across human space, each one carrying Liberty as part of their name. The Liberty's Dawn, the Liberty's Hammer, the Liberty Rises, and dozens more. They were crewed by volunteers who knew they probably wouldn't survive their missions, but who had learned from Morrison's example that sometimes the most important victory was the simple refusal to accept defeat. The Zephyrians were learning what it meant to face an enemy that drew strength from hopeless odds. The war continued, but now it was the aliens who were discovering what humans had always known: that the hardest enemy to defeat is the one who simply will not quit.